They thought it was just a joke. They thought no one would hold them accountable. But what they didn't know, the man they humiliated wasn't just another victim, was about to become their new boss. And what happened next? Karma hit harder than they ever imagined. Marcus Reynolds had always believed in justice. After spending 2 decades in law enforcement, he had built a reputation as a fair and disciplined leader. His record spoke for itself, reducing crime in multiple cities, implementing better police training, and holding corrupt officers accountable. Now, he had been appointed as the new chief of police in a town notorious for its history of racial profiling and abuse of power. But Marcus wasn't the type of man who walked into a precinct and immediately demanded respect, earned it. Instead of introducing himself with press conferences and department meetings, he wanted to see the reality of his officers' behavior without them knowing who he was. So, on his first night in town, Marcus left his badge, gun, and uniform behind. He threw on a pair of jeans, a jacket, and a hoodie, just an average man walking through the city's streets. He wanted to observe firsthand how the officers under his command treated everyday people. What he didn't know was that before the night was over, he would find himself at the center of the corruption he had been sent to eliminate. The streets were nearly empty, dimly lit by flickering streetlights. It wasn't a dangerous part of town, just quiet, the kind of place where people minded their business. Marcus walked past a convenience store, the cool night air brushing against his face. He noticed a police car parked nearby, but he paid little attention until it started moving. The squad car rolled slowly beside him, creeping forward like a predator stalking prey. Marcus felt the familiar sensation in his gooth was being watched. Then, the red and blue lights flashed. He stopped walking. The squad car skidded to a halt, and 2 officers, Officer Blake and Officer Harris, stepped out with smirks on their faces. Well, what do we have here?" Blake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Out for a little late-night stroll, huh?" Marcus turned to face them, keeping his voice calm. "Is there a problem, officers?" Blake chuckled. "That depends. You live around here?" Marcus knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about a crime being committed. It wasn't about public safety. It was about power. They had seen a black man walking alone at night and decided he didn't belong. Marcus kept his posture relaxed. "Do I need permission to walk in this town?" That was the moment Blake and Harris decided they didn't like him. From harassment to humiliation. Blake stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster. "We ask the questions. And you? You look awfully suspicious." "Suspicious? For what? Walking? Existing?" Marcus had seen this scenario too many times. Only this time, he was the one being targeted. "Hands where I can see him," Harris ordered. Marcus exhaled slowly, keeping his movements deliberate as he raised his hands slightly. "I'd be careful about how you handle this, officers," he warned. Harris smirked. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Blake turned to his partner, laughing. "Maybe he's famous. Maybe we're supposed to roll out the red carpet." Marcus felt his blood simmer. These weren't just bad officers. These were men who thought their badge made them invincible. Then came the moment that crossed the line. Blake turned to Harris and said, loud enough for Marcus to hear, "What do you say, partner? Think we should teach this guy a little respect?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew what was coming next. Tied to a pole like a criminal. Before he could react, Blake grabbed his arm. Marcus didn't resist, didn't need to. He wanted to see how far these men would go. Within seconds, they pushed him against the pole of a streetlight, yanking his arms behind him. Marcus clenched his teeth as he felt plastic zip ties biting into his wrists. "This oughta keep you out of trouble," Blake sneered. Harris laughed as he tightened the ties even more. "Maybe next time, you'll learn not to mouth off to the cops." Marcus couldn't believe it. These men had just detained, restrained, and humiliated him in public hall for nothing. They took a step back, grinning like schoolyard bullies. They had no idea they had just tied up their new boss. The watchful eyes of the community. As Marcus stood there, bound to a pole, he noticed something else. People were watching. A woman across the street had stopped in her tracks, clutching her purse as she gaped in shock. A man at the corner gas station shook his head, mumbling something under his breath. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about every person these officers had ever done this to before. Blake clapped his hands together. "All right, let's get out of here," he said, turning to leave. Marcus took one slow, deep breath. And then, fate intervened. A third squad car pulled up. The door slammed open, and out stepped Lieutenant Daniels, the second in command at the precinct. Marcus saw the instant recognition in Daniels' eyes. His face paled as he took in the Sinhai's new chief of police, tied to a pole like a criminal. Daniels' expression hardened. He turned slowly to Blake and Harris. "Do you idiots have any idea who this man is?" Blake chuckled. "Just some mouthy guy who—" Daniels cut him off. "That's Marcus Reynolds, your new police chief." Silence. Pure, deafening silence. And in that moment, the officers knew they had just destroyed their own careers. Marcus Reynolds stood against the cold metal pole, his wrists tightly bound by zip ties, his breath slow and steady. He had spent years fighting against corruption, working to build trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. But tonight, he was the victim. He had seen power-hungry officers like Blake and Harris, before the type who wore their badges like a crown, instead of a duty. The type who thought they could harass, humiliate, and abuse anyone they wanted without consequence. But tonight, they had picked the wrong man. As the two officers turned to leave, a new set of headlights cut through the dark street. A third squad car pulled up to the scene. The door swung open sharply, and out stepped Lieutenant Daniels, the precinct's second in command. Daniels had been with the department for over a decade, and he knew every officer under his command, but the man zip-tied to the pole was not one of them. He froze in his tracks, his eyes locking onto Marcus. His face went pale as he took in the scene before him, the grinning officers, the stunned onlookers, and the man they had humiliated. A man he immediately recognized. The newly appointed chief of police. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He turned his head slowly toward Blake and Harris, his entire body radiating fury. "What the hell is going on here?" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the night like a gunshot. Blake and Harris snapped to attention, clearly not expecting a superior officer to arrive. But instead of realizing their mistake, Blake scoffed. "Relax, LT. Just dealing with a guy who got too mouthy. Thought we'd teach him a little respect." Marcus stayed quiet. He wanted to see just how far they would dig their own graves. Daniels exhaled sharply, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "You idiots," he muttered under his breath. Then, in a voice dripping with barely contained rage, he asked, "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Blake rolled his eyes. "Yeah, some guy who—" Daniels cut him off immediately. "That's Marcus Reynolds, your new police chief." A silence so thick, it felt like the entire street had gone still. Blake staggered back a step, his smirk vanishing instantly. Harris's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Marcus watched them closely, the panic setting in, their confidence melting away like ice under a blazing sun. Harris stammered, No way, that's not possible." Daniels didn't even look at him. His eyes remained locked on Blake, the ringleader of this disaster. "You two just tied up your own boss like a criminal," Daniels said coldly. "I hope you're prepared for what comes next." Blake was shaking now. "Two didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't—" Marcus finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, and dangerous. "You didn't know because you didn't care to ask." Blake reached for his belt, fumbling to grab his knife. "Let me cut you loose, sir." Marcus raised a hand. "Don't touch me." Blake froze mid-step. The air around them felt like a storm about to break. Daniel stepped forward instead, pulling out his own blade and slicing through the zip ties in one smooth motion. The plastic restraints fell to the ground, leaving Marcus rubbing his wrists. The entire precinct would soon hear about this, but first, he took a slow step forward, standing face to face with the officers who had humiliated him just minutes ago. Blake couldn't meet his gaze. Harris looked ready to faint. "You thought this was funny?" Marcus asked. His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was crushing. "Sir, Blake started, but Marcus wasn't finished. "You thought it was okay to abuse your badge? To To restrain an innocent man for fun? To act like your power gives you the right to do whatever you want? Neither officer spoke. They couldn't. How many other people have you done this to? Marcus continued, stepping even closer. How many men have you bullied, harassed, and humiliated just because you thought no one would stop you? Blake's lips trembled. Harris was practically wishing he could disappear. You think your badge protects you? Marcus pressed on. Let me tell you something. It doesn't. Daniels turned to the officers, his patience at its limit. Blake, Harris, turn in your badges, right now. Blake staggered back. Wait, we can explain. Explain to who? Daniels snapped. To the press? To the department? To the public when they see your new boss was tied to a pole like some criminal? Harris swallowed hard. They knew there was no coming back from this. Badge, now, Daniels repeated. Both officers reached for their uniforms, their fingers trembling as they removed their badges and set them in Daniels' outstretched hand. Marcus watched them, unblinking. Your guns too, he added. Blake hesitated. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Or do you want me to personally have internal affairs collect them for you? Blake immediately unholstered his weapon and placed it beside his badge. Harris followed. Daniels turned to Marcus. What do you want to do with them, sir? Marcus took a deep breath, looking them over one last time. Suspension. Indefinitely, he said. And first thing tomorrow, this department is getting a full review. Blake and Harris had thought they were untouchable, that their badge would protect them. They had never been more wrong. And as Marcus walked away, leaving them standing there with nothing but the weight of their own mistakes, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The moment the zip ties were cut, Marcus rubbed his wrists and stepped forward. The officers stood frozen, looking like deer caught in headlights. Here's the deal, Marcus said, staring them down. You're both done. I don't need racist, power-hungry officers in my precinct. You abused your badge. You humiliated an innocent man. And now? He leaned in closer. Now, you answer to me. Daniels, still shaking his head in disgust, pulled out 2 suspension forms. Turn in your badges. Now. Blake stared at the ground, unable to even look at Marcus. Harris tried to stammer out an apology, but Marcus wasn't interested. The next morning, every officer in the precinct found out what happened. Some were shocked. Others? Not surprised at all. Blake and Harris had been getting away with their behavior for years, but their time was up. After an internal investigation, the department had no choice but to terminate both officers. Their careers in law enforcement? Over. Chief Reynolds immediately instituted reforms, making it clear that racism and abuse of power would not be tolerated. Officers who had similar complaints against them were put under review. The story spread quickly. Local citizens felt a sense of justice, knowing that the new chief wasn't just another politician, he was a man who had lived through injustice himself. The firing of the officers set an example abuse of power would be dealt with. Officers who had previously stayed silent about the corruption finally came forward. Marcus gained the respect of both his officers and the public, proving that true leadership means standing against injustice even when it's coming from within. This story proves that power should never be abused, because karma will come knocking. Blake and Harris thought they could treat people however they wanted. They thought their badges made them untouchable. But when they tied that man to a pole for fun, they didn't just ruin their own careers. They handed their futures to the very man who now had the power to erase them from the force. Marcus didn't have to yell. He didn't have to fight. He let the truth destroy them. Subscribe for more powerful stories that expose injustice and celebrate those who stand up for what's right.